My name is Morris Williams, and it's my privilege to welcome all of you to the Free Library of Philadelphia. Please turn off your cell phones and any other items that you might have that might interrupt the wonderful talk and interview that we will have this afternoon. The second is to encourage you to spread the word about all the many activities that are involved at the Free Library of Philadelphia. In particular, remind your friends about LEAP, the program in all of the libraries in the afternoon where children can come and have educational opportunities, and teenagers have the opportunity to work, and where there has been a very high graduation rate for the teenagers that have been involved with that. So LEAP is a wonderful program that merits support from all of us. Now, on to Dark Money, the hidden history of billionaires behind the rise of the radical right. I have 2 copies, and I hope you will end up having 2 copies and join the author after the talk and interview to have her sign it, because I think the book is extraordinarily important in terms of the subject that is going on here, in terms of the influence of roughly probably 100 people in the United States who are trying to control not only the political agenda, but the social and environmental agendas. And for me, the most important thing is not just the money. The most important thing is the disclosure, because Jane goes into quite elaborate analysis of how they use multiple units to hide who is in fact funding all of this activity. And it's my opinion, in this day and age of the internet, all dollars should be fully disclosed within 24 hours, and I urge you to join me in writing our politicians in Washington, our elected officers, to try to push for more disclosure. Now, if you buy the book, there's a bio about Jane and the fact that she's a staff writer for the New Yorker, and she's won all kinds of awards for her investigative reporting. Perhaps you might be interested that it's not on the bio. She graduated from Yale, and perhaps most interesting, she started her journalism career after Yale working in Vermont for a couple of newspapers up there. So maybe we'll ask her about Bernie Sanders and her early impressions of his political career when she was there. She also worked for the Wall Street Journal. She covered the White House. She covered the Persian Gulf War. So she knows extensively about the political analysis and about wars, and that she did before she moved on to her current role at the New Yorker. She's going to be interviewed by Dick Polman, who's a writer in residence of the University of Pennsylvania, and he at Penn is teaching students in journalism, and hopefully he'll be training the next group of people that will pick up and follow in the footsteps of Jane Meyer. So let's give a warm Philadelphia welcome to Jane Meyer and Dick Polman.
Thank you all for coming on this less than balmy day. Thanks to the Free Library, certainly for inviting Jane and for having me back again as a questioner. We're just going to, some of you have been in the programs before, I'm sure, but those of you who haven't, we're going to talk for a little bit, and then about halfway through, open it up for audience questions, and I'm sure there's a lot to talk about. This book could not be more timely. Particularly if anybody's been watching the recent Democratic debates, you know how timely it is. So I guess we'll just start by defining our terms about money and politics, about big money and politics. I mean, everybody's concerned about it, but sometimes I hear people say, well, there's always been big money in politics, and there were stories 60 years ago about JFK getting suitcases of cash in Las Vegas, and Richard Nixon getting loads of money from, I think it was a pharmaceutical guy named Clement Stone. And so there's always been, that kind of a thing. And then sometimes people say to me, well, there's a lot of candidates who have a lot of money, or they're backed by a lot of money, but they often lose. So, granted, those are all true. But what do you think, at least in terms of the book, is the most concrete connection that you can make for us between the big money that's in politics today and its impact on our politics?
Well, just to take the question of there's always been money, is there anything different going on? It is true, there's always been money in American politics, and there probably always will be. But there's been rich Democratic backers, there have been rich Republican backers in recent times. But what we've got right now is almost like a third party that's becoming the money party. So you've got a small group of about 400 to 500 of the richest businessmen in the country who share a conservative philosophy who've pooled their money. And they are not just working through the Republican Party, they are trying to put a war chest together that they have a budget 2016 election cycle. They're holding this kitty out saying to candidates, if you come our way and take our positions on all kinds of policies, we'll back you. And so it's becoming a kind of an outside force in American politics. It's like a third party. The Koch organization has, they call it the network, and they call the members of it their investors. It's completely secret who they are. They won't disclose the names of the donors, but years of reporting has brought out a number of the names of these people. But they have now in their employ 2 to 3 times the number of paid employees as the Republican National Committee. They have a budget that's twice what the Republican National Committee had in 2012. So you're really talking about something different here. It's a tiny, intense group of enormously wealthy and very ideologically, potent people who have their own interests. And they are not getting elected. They're not running for election. They're using their money to influence what's happening in the election. So that's what I see as sort of slightly different. And the actual numbers of the money, it explodes every 2 to 4 years. It gets dizzying how fast it's been going since in Citizens United. And while there's always been money in American politics, people don't really remember how fast this has changed recently. There are waves of scandal and then reform. And it wasn't very long ago, in the 1980 presidential election, both Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan spent no private money. They took public funding. And people think, oh, it's always been this corrupt and this messed up. It's actually become like this pretty darn fast.
Yeah, the public funding, post-Watergate public funding thing has pretty much fallen apart at this point.
It has. But again, you have these cycles, this pendulum swinging back and forth, and we're in kind of a high water mark right now of huge undisclosed spending. So it's an experiment that we're seeing kind of unfold in front of our eyes, and you have people like John McCain, Republican senator from Arizona, who has tried to reform the campaign finance system, who just said, this is a scandal waiting to happen. And it'll take that, he worries, before some new kind of reforms will take place.
There's a quote in your book attributed to someone at the Republican National Committee, this is from 2 years ago, who said, it's pretty clear, referring, I think, to the Koch brothers and the Kochtopus, as you call it in the book, by the way, that it's pretty clear that they don't want to work with the party, but they want to supplant it. How close are they to actually, when you said there's like a third force, how close are they to becoming de facto Republican Party?
Well,
or is that too broad?
No, it's, and I think this is, I'm really glad you asked this, because people might think that it's only Democrats who are worried about the Kochs. There are a lot of Republicans who are worried about what's happening in their own party, because this private, enormously wealthy club of people are in some ways supplanting the Republican Party. They have their own private big data operation, their own get out the vote operation. They have an enormously powerful grassroots group called Americans for Prosperity that has headquarters in 38 states now. And in many ways, they are the tail wagging the dog. So that there's a paper that just came out of Harvard, a government professor there named Theda Skocpol just put out a paper called The Koch Effect, and it tries to analyze what the impact of all this is. And what she and her co-author argue is that the Koch money group, this network, is creating a magnetic force that is pulling the whole Republican Party off to the right on economic issues. And in order to get the backing of the group, the candidates, of course, go where the money is. And so it's becoming something of a tug on the party, and many people in the party don't appreciate that. I interviewed a number of Republicans in the book who speak out about it, saying that there's for instance, a congressman from Ohio, Steve LaTourette, who was a Republican congressman, who says he decided to quit finally. He couldn't stand what the money was doing to the party. He said, you can no longer solve any problems. All they want to do is obstruct everything. And there's no place for moderates in his party, he felt, which is what he was. He represented sort of, Main Street Republicans from Ohio. So there are people like that who are really feeling threatened by this.
Have you had a chance to watch, in all your touring, have you had a chance to watch any of the Republican debates?
I watch all of the Republican debates.
I mean, tell me that isn't the best entertainment on television.
Sort of I come from a kind of a sick household. My husband is the Washington editor of the New York Times, and our daughter's a political science major in college. So every normal family is doing something fun, and we're sitting there practically with popcorn watching the debates.
Saturday night, this Saturday night.
Can't wait.
So the reason I ask, of course, is watching those debates, hearing what most of these candidates are talking about. Obviously, they believe a lot of these things anyway, I would presume, right? But are you hearing things, is there anything that you can point to share with us that they're saying that you think has that sort of
Kochian ring?
A Kochian ring to it. I mean,
yes,
I can think of a couple.
Absolutely. I mean, in fact, I find it's stunning the extent to which the Republican presidential candidates right now are voicing opinions that Charles Koch started voicing, in 1976. But most specifically right now, I think if you're picking a single issue where you can really see the influence of the Koch group, their network, it's certainly on global warming. There's not a single Republican candidate, including Donald Trump, who acknowledges that global warming is real and a problem. You have the entire rest of the world going the opposite direction, almost all of science going the opposite direction. And there's no accounting for why the Republican candidates are taking this position other than the amount of money that is coming in to the Republican politics from the fossil fuel interests who are represented in large part in the Koch group. In the book, one of the things I tried to do was figure out who are these people? Since the public's not allowed to know what their identities are, I thought, it's time to sort of pull back the curtain and just, as a sort of a public service, I think the country deserves to know who's kind of manipulating politics. So many of the people in this group are super powerful and wealthy fossil fuel interests. There are people you probably have never heard of, somebody named Corbin Benson, for instance, from Texas, whose company Quintana is the single largest private holder of coal in this country. He has bet huge on it, and he's got more coal than anybody else in the country other than the U.S. government. And there are tons of other, there are frackers. The major fracking interests are in this group. Howard Ham is one of them. Someone from Devon Industries, Energy is another one. They're hugely powerful, wealthy fracking interests. There's oil, there's gas, and the Kochs, of course, make their money refining oil as do several of the others in this group, and having pipelines.
Yeah,
So-
it's just kind of a shame that I don't think any of the moderators in any of the Republican debates have actually framed a question in that regard. I mean, they rarely ask them to even comment about climate change as an issue.
No, I mean, I generally think that debates are fantastic learning experiences for the whole country, but we're kind of seeing a bifurcation of who's moderating the debates, so that you're beginning to see, Republican or conservative-leaning news organizations moderating the Republican debates and liberal ones doing the Democratic debates. It would be much better if it was the other way around. You'd get much more kind of oppositional questioning. But these fossil fuel interests are it's a stupendously powerful industry and a big part of our economic sector, and it's concentrated in this money group, and they have exerted a great influence on the Republican Party's position on climate change. And what's interesting is, if you look at it over time, in truth, American public opinion was more open-minded towards climate change, even in the Republican side, just a few years back. But they have poured so much money into creating confusion about the science and turning it into almost a touchstone issue that is an emotional issue that you can't oppose if you're a Republican now. You can't break with the party. And those that do have been very much targeted by the Kochs. There's a story I tell in the book about Robert Inglis, who was a congressman from South Carolina, and congressman or senator, I'm trying to remember, congressman from South Carolina, who was very conservative. He's a Christian conservative, and he went on a congressional trip to one of the poles where they pulled out a core sample of ice, and there in front of his eyes he could see the effect of climate change. And he suddenly realized, oh my God, this thing is real. So he changed his position on it. So much money went at him, knocked him out when he ran for re-election. And he's now, he talks very openly about this is the thing that killed him. You cannot go against the orthodoxy in the party on that and survive, he thinks.
And are you including, and I have a reason for bringing John Kasich up, which I'll get to in a second. You including John Kasich in this category? He doesn't acknowledge global warming being real either?
He's been a little better, and he's the closest you've got to, it's a mixed view. What he'll say, and I may be wrong, but what I remember of him saying is that it's something that's real, but it's not a top problem, and that the solutions to it may be worse than the problem. So he's
That's
not,
way to the left, isn't it?
That's the liberal position in the Republican Party at this point.
Well, I bring him up because you tell a story about him in the book, which was so interesting. He was, and I didn't know this quote, which has been thrown back at him since. I didn't know this happened at a Koch retreat. Jane's book has this anecdote where he's invited by the Koch brothers to one of their retreats, and somebody there asked him about why, as governor of Ohio, did you agree to expand the Medicaid program under Obamacare? And he said, and I'm only paraphrasing slightly, he said something like, look, lady, when I get to the pearly gates or something, I want to be known as being compassionate to the poor. And correct me if I'm wrong, but that was the last time the Koch brothers invited him to a retreat. He has not been back.
That is right. They expect more fealty, I think. But it was a great statement that he made. I think he said, basically, when I get there to St. Peter, I don't think he's going to ask me what I've done to shrink government. I think he's going to ask me what I've done for the poor. And there was kind of gasps in the audience of the big donors, and he was not invited back. It does make me respect John Kasich. It's very hard, I think, for candidates to say no to this kind of money. It's corrupting. And having spent a number of years writing about and researching the Kochs, I guess I feel that and it's not just them, it's not just a Republican problem either, but that kind of money is corrupting in general. There's so many anecdotes I've heard about the Koch family that make you begin to think and understand that they feel they can buy anything and buy anyone. And whether it's getting their friends' kids into the schools they want, or from there on up, everything. Their money opens so many doors, and there's so few people who turn it away.
So do you think, and I have to bring up Donald Trump, how can we not? One question, at least in that respect anyway, does Donald Trump, do you feel that he is, should be lauded, I suppose, for saying in a tweet, I believe, that the Republican candidates who go to the Koch brothers for money are quote-unquote puppets?
Puppets. Well,
whereas he doesn't need to?
I think, you know, probably the appeal, the one of the few ways that Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders have anything in common is both of them are appealing to the public in that they are denouncing what they're saying is the corruption of the campaign finance system. And Donald Trump's saying, I'm not owned by anyone. I'm a billionaire. I own myself. And Bernie Sanders saying, I'm just taking tiny donations. And I think that the fact that both have gotten so far on that message shows that the public's pretty disgusted with this idea that just a small handful of the richest people in the country could set themselves up in a way to try to pick who our leaders are. I mean, I think whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, that's kind of an idea that really doesn't sit well with American voters, that just the richest people are going to pick, the next president and what the policies are. And both of them are I think, playing well to that. That said, I think you may find by Election Day that the big money has kind of reasserted itself. We'll have to see. I don't know, but I may be surprised if Bernie Sanders gets the nomination, and I think it's still highly possible that Trump won't get the nomination. And even if he does, his campaign manager, Corey Lewandowski, the job that he had right before working for Trump was working for the Kochs, running their big grassroots group, Americans for Prosperity. I'm telling you, the Kochtopus, the tentacles are everywhere.
Well, all right. Well, your mention of Bernie is a perfect segue, because I should ask at least one, for sake of balance, one question about the Democrats. Last night's debate, again, it came up about midway through. Bernie was talking a lot again about sort of like, kind of a blanket condemnation about our corrupt system and the big money in politics. And of course, he's aiming it, without much specific, but he's aiming it in part at his opponent who's standing there on the stage, and she has a super PAC, he does not. But by the same token, she's been saying, and she said it 2 debates ago, I challenge you to name a single vote or action that I have taken that can be tied to some kind of Wall Street or special interest money. And he didn't name anything specific last night, too. So on one hand, he's got the blanket condemnation, and on the other hand, she's saying, it hasn't affected me, and President Obama took Wall Street money, she said last night, and it didn't affect him to stand up to Wall Street. So what's the right calculation from your perspective here? Is she, when she's basically saying there's nothing you can tie me to getting all this money, that you can't tie to any action I've taken, is that accurate, or does it come in your mind with a caveat?
I think that both parties, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, have moved in the direction of the interests of their elite and wealthy donors. And that partly what you're seeing is this outpouring of anger out there is that many middle class and working class voters feel they've been left behind. So, I mean, it's very hard as a reporter, to connect the dots and absolutely argue that somebody's changed their vote or taken a position because of what their backers have said. But you can see on things like trade policy that a lot of the positions taken by the Democratic Party, whether it was Clinton under, pushing NAFTA, have hurt working manufacturing companies and wage earners in America. And that was something where the party took a position that was against organized labor's point of view and sided with the big manufacturing owners, the wealthy donors to the Democratic Party. You can see in Wall Street that some people think that Dodd-Frank got pretty watered down and really hasn't done that much. And as Bernie was arguing last night, that people haven't gone to jail for, I think one person went to jail for the whole 2008 meltdown. And I was just thinking recently, I should do a story about that person. One person, boy, what an unlucky person to be the,
That's a great
the
story.
only one to go to jail. But at any rate, for the most part, nobody went to jail for that. And so, you know, I think there's an anger that as the money has become more important, and both parties have to go to where the money is. For the Democrats, it's often Wall Street. They leave behind a lot of the interests of the rank and file voters, and a lot of those people are mad. So,
Well, I'm going to ask a few writing questions about the book, putting the book together, just to shift up. We'll probably come back to politics with some of the questions, I'm sure. But I was just curious, just in writing the book, I mean, this is kind of the age-old journalist's question, really. You worked on it for 5 years. How do you know when you've got enough stuff?
well, so yesterday I went and had an MRI, and turns out I have a herniated disc, and I think I kind of knew that I had to stop. I couldn't sit there any longer. My back was hurting, so that's one way you tell that you're at the end. But other than that, you know, you just get to the point where you know too much almost, and
Right.
things start repeating themselves. Or you get to the, you know, you get such fantastic material and you can't wait to write it. I mean, some of the stuff you just can't. I love the stories about the families in this book. These are the book doesn't just talk about the Koch family, but in it itself is just a wild story. But there are a bunch of other families who've been the major funders of right-wing politics, and each one, you know, is truly a saga in its own right. And so, you know, I kind of got to the point where I was really antsy to write it all down.
I presume you reached out to the Koch brothers and asked them for interviews.
I did.
And I'm just wondering, you know, I mean, obviously they know what's coming. They know about your 2010 New Yorker piece. How do you go about something like that? Do you send them letters? You don't tell them questions, but how do you frame an interview request to a target, essentially?
Well, I mean, they weren't really, I mean, and I don't really think of them as targets necessarily. They were subjects, and I think, you know, it's always better if they will cooperate. You want to know how they think and what their stories are and how they explain themselves. So I did keep trying, and I got to be on pretty first name basis with the spokesman for Koch Industries and sent her lots of emails. And I also went to their lawyer and asked, who I had on a panel discussion for the New Yorker, and said, would you send a message to them? You know, I really would love to talk to them, even if just off the record. They have a long history, though. It's not just me, of being, of not just the way they dealt with me, of being extraordinarily secretive. Charles Koch always said he had a motto, which was, he got it from his dad, and it's when the whale spouts that it gets harpooned. And he preferred to swim under the water. So, you know, the fact that they weren't talking to me was not unusual. They really have not given many interviews. Until quite recently, they've been on a charm offensive. But even so, they've been turning down the kinds of interviews with no limitations on them. So they turned down a request from 60 Minutes. I think a number of major newspapers have rejected the ground rules that the Kochs wanted to set. And so they haven't done interviews with them either. They try very much, they always want to control it.
So some of you, maybe most of you, know that at some point, and you can tell us exactly when you learned this, the Koch brothers hired, their organization hired some people to, let's just say, look into Jane's life, which is obviously a pretty chilling kind of response. I'm just wondering, A, did you expect anything like that? Did you expect anything like that, and how did you find out about it in the first place?
No, I didn't expect anything like that, because I've been a reporter for such a long time and covered so many different things. You know, wars and the fall of the Berlin Wall and the blowing up of the Marine barracks in Beirut and the CIA and the Reagan White House. And there are plenty of powerful people and secretive organizations I've covered, and nobody's done anything like that before. And I covered business for the Wall Street Journal, so I've covered other businesses too. I've never seen anything quite like it. So I actually thought it was a joke when I first heard about it. I'd done the piece on the Kochs for the New Yorker, and it kind of exposed for the first time in a big way their financing of opposition to Obama. It came out in 2010, and it explained that they sort of behind the scenes had been funding some of the uprising that came to be thought of as the Tea Party. And they didn't like the piece, but there were no errors in it. And so they were just plain unhappy, and we figured they'd just gone away. And then I started to hear, it came out in August, and then in the fall, a couple people said to me, what do you think about this private eye that's looking at you? And I truly did think it was a joke. And then at a Christmas party, someone said to me, a private eye asked whether I could do a special investigation into a reporter in Washington that's being paid for by two very conservative billionaire brothers, and who want to look at a reporter whose work they didn't like. And then she said, it occurred to me it might be you. And I was still sort of thinking, oh, well, this is a joke. Because I actually have a very uninteresting life. We're sitting there watching the debates at home and not doing a lot else. And so anyway, then the editor of The New Yorker was contacted shortly after that in early January by two conservative news organizations that said they were going with exposés of me the next day. They somehow both had the same story at the same time, which suggested a little coordination was going on behind the scenes. And the story was that I was a plagiarist, and that I had plagiarized from 4 different stories over 10 years. Someone had gone through 10 years of my work. And I said, can I see what the examples are? And I took a look at it, and it was ridiculous, but I knew also it was going to just be, ruinous to have this in print. And it was really a, kind of a bullet to the head. So I had overnight to try to deal with it, and I got a hold of the authors of the 4 stories, and they turned out to all be terrific stand-up colleagues who put out public statements saying, we have not been plagiarized from, this is ridiculous, this is not true. One of them looked up the story, I hadn't even had a chance to look at it yet, and he said, not only did you not plagiarize from me, you credited me in the next frigging sentence, and I had linked to his story online. I mean, it was really a hatchet job of the first order, and luckily it fell apart because it was such a crummy hatchet job and untrue. But you could see if I hadn't been able to act fast enough, it might have really been something that you see in my Wikipedia, or that everybody would believe from then on out. And both news organizations, when they saw the statements from the writers, backed off doing it. And one of them, the New York Post, to its credit, started reporting further and wanted to know, so who was behind the smear? And they did a story called Smear Disappears, and they floated the idea that the Kochs were behind it. And it took me actually years. I was, interested, obviously, in how this had all come about, and it took me years to piece it together. And I finally got a couple great sources, including one who knew a lot about it, who said to me, quote unquote, they were digging for dirt, and if they couldn't find it, they'd make it up. And he said they'd hired the Koch operatives in Washington who work for Koch Industries, this giant private corporation, had been working with a private eye in New York who was the former commissioner of police, Howard Safer.
Right.
And
for
he and
Giuliani,
right? For Giuliani. And he and his son had apparently come up with this, the stories that they were going to plant on me. And they haven't commented. I called him up when I figured it out and asked him directly, because as a reporter, that's what you do. And all the Safer family would say, both father and son, was, we can't comment on who we work for. And sorry, we're not going to be able to discuss this. And that was, but they've never denied it either, I can tell you.
And so, and we're going to go to questions in 1 second. So basically, though, since the book came out, we were talking about this backstage, the Koch brothers have been, their reaction to the book has been nothing.
They've been very quiet for the most part.
Right,
I mean,
just let it go.
I want to say one other thing about their use of private eyes, which is I did discover as I was researching the book, I'm far from alone. I mean, what's more interesting in a way than what happened with my situation was it was just a little peek at what their modus operandi is. they've hired private eyes to take on people who've challenged them for decades, including two of the brothers have sided against two of the other brothers. And in the two teams of brothers, each hired their own private eyes that dug into each other's garbage, literally. So they've taken on federal prosecutors when they were under investigation for environmental crimes. The lawyer who was representing, there was a horrible pipeline explosion that killed two teenagers, and the family of the teenagers hired a lawyer to bring a civil suit. That lawyer's office, he discovered, was filled with electronic bugs. And he says, I'm not saying the Kochs did it, I'm just saying it's interesting. It happened when I was doing that case. And there are so many other people telling stories like that in this book that it begins to give you a sense of their ruthlessness, which is, I think, why it's important for reporters to write about them. They are unaccountable centers of extreme power in the country who want to operate in the dark. They want to spend dark money, but they really need to be brought out into the sunlight, I think.
Yeah,
so
I think they sound like a Netflix series waiting to happen, I think. But,
I'm hoping.
All right, we're going to, let's go to some questions. You guys must have questions. Someone here has two hands up. Let me just sort of make the one request, which from time immemorial, which is please to have succinct questions as opposed to grandiloquence.
It seems obvious that if you have $889 million, you can get candidates to listen to you. But how do you get tens of millions of voters to buy into what those candidates are saying? Is that part of the scheme somehow? Is there a plan?
So this is a really good question, and it gets to the heart of what the book is really about. Elections are only the final stage of what the Kochs have been working on. For 4 decades, they have been building up, how do you describe it? It's a network of interlocking organizations to change how Americans think, to get voters to vote their way. So what they've done is, David and Charles Koch are both graduates of MIT. They're engineers. They looked at the American political system as an engineering problem. And they tried to figure out, how do you manufacture political change? How do you bring the country far to the right on economic issues? They started this in the late 1970s, and they have come up with an answer, which is you have to change public opinion by changing elite opinion. You fund think tanks, which they've done. You fund intellectuals who turn out papers that are taking your position. You fund pressure groups that look like spontaneous outbreaks of citizens pushing for these policies, who take those papers and demand that those policies be implemented, and you pressure people in office to take these positions. So if you look in the front of the book, you'll see this diagram, and this is what we were joking about, the Kochtopus. I didn't actually coin that phrase. It's the libertarians that came up with it themselves. But it's an assembly line for political change to try to get Americans to see the world the way the Kochs see it. When they first tried running for office, which is their one sort of attempt at doing it the old-fashioned way through sort of democratic elections, David Koch ran for vice president in 1980 on the Libertarian ticket, and he 60% of the money spent in that campaign was his own, and he got less than 1% of the vote in America. The Kochs were running against Ronald Reagan from the right because they thought Reagan was too liberal. And so they gave up on the idea of elections, or at least running for office themselves, and decided to create this kind of assembly line and fund a counterintelligentsia, basically. And that's what the book is mostly about. It's about how they've built up experts of their own who speak on the air. They've paid some of the talk radio people to take their positions on things. They've, on things like global warming, they've paid for scientific studies that say things like that the polar bears have never been doing better than now. And at a certain point, it gets very confusing to most of the public who is unable to see that there's this kind of underground money river that's going into all these what appear to be unrelated groups, and eventually creates a kind of groundswell and convinces a lot of people they're right.
So by the time people are ready to vote, their minds have already been changed to some extent.
That's the idea.
I want to make sure we get somebody in the back, because often people in the back get short shrift.
The Kochs are good friends with Dan Grossman, who's been head of the Atlas Economic Research Foundation that actually started the right-wing think tanks in a very sophisticated way, and Dan Grossman is definitely a whale that does not spout. There was a TV show series right after 9/11 called Rubicon, and it was pulled. And in the TV series, there was an organization called Atlas McDowell, which sounds a lot less like Atlas Mercator to me. And it involved what you're talking about, a group of people from different disciplines with different efforts taking over, basically, and far more than just the election process. Can you comment on that?
Well, I don't know about Atlas McDowell. There are a number of Atlas organizations that seem to be sort of free market groups, that some of which get Koch money. I don't know if it's because of Atlas Shrugged or because there is a kind of Ayn Rand sort of tie into a lot of these things. But, one thing I neglected to say that I think is important and interesting here in Philadelphia, because you have so many great academic institutions, is a very big part of the push has been to create programs in universities and colleges that are privately funded by the Kochs, but pushing their point of view, often in state schools too. They've now, and this is an early focus that Charles Koch talks about in a paper that I describe in this that hadn't been seen before. He wrote it in 1976. And he's talking about how the youth are the way to kind of, you create a youth identity movement, and you can get to people when they're young, and then as they grow in stature, they become powerful and good investments to you. They're described as being like bottles of wine. They're cheap in the beginning, and then they get more valuable over time. And so they've been funding a ton of university programs. There's a little tiny bit of money going to Penn, really small amount of money from one of Charles Koch's foundations. But there's tons of money in many other places. They've now got programs in somewhere between 200 and 300 different colleges and universities. And many of them have strings attached, so that the academic institutions have agreed to teach the subjects that the funders want, and in some cases use the faculty members they want or hire the kinds of people they want. And so there's in the last chapter of the book, which is called Selling the New Koch, there's a tape that has come out of some of the Koch people talking to the donors, some of their operatives, and they're saying, we've built an unrivaled talent pipeline. We take the best students from these programs, we put them into state think tanks and national think tanks and into our grassroots groups, and what we have, they describe it as an integrated network. So you see that it's kind of a, creating cadres out there. It's very interesting, and again, you can kind of see it as the creation of engineers, I think.
Over here on this side, a couple people here.
How do you account for the Koch's seeming push for criminal justice reform?
It's again part of this last chapter. I get into it a little bit, and I actually just did a piece for the New Yorker that goes beyond what's in the book, but it's part of the new selling the new Koch. What happened to the Kochs was after 2012, they had supported Mitt Romney in a big way, and their donor group had poured money into it, and obviously it was a crushing disappointment to them. And they, as businessmen, they're very smart. I mean, they've had enormous success, and they do a lot with analytics and try to understand and learn from their mistakes. And they did the same with the 2012 election. They did a lot of studying about what went wrong. They did focus groups and polls, and they came to the conclusion, their research told them, that people regarded libertarian businessmen like themselves as greedy and not having the public interest in mind. And so they describe it in this tape. You'll hear there's quite an interesting talk by one of their top political people who says, literally he says, we are looked at as greedy, and if we want to win over the middle third of America, those that are undecided, which we have to do if we're going to take over American politics, we need to be seen as compassionate. We need to be seen as caring about the poor and caring about fairness. And he says, and we're going to look for opportunities to create unlikely alliances that will make it look like we care about solving society's problems. And so it was right after that that they started championing criminal justice reform for people who are locked up in prisons on drug offenses, nonviolent drug offenses. The Kochs had been interested before that in a different kind of criminal justice reform. They had been involved for a number of years, ever since they were prosecuted. Koch Industries was prosecuted for huge environmental crimes. They argued that they were unfairly prosecuted, and they tried to diminish the power of the Justice Department to bring cases against white-collar criminals. So they'd been working on behalf of their own kind of corporate criminal justice reform for a number of years. But at this point, when they started to realize they needed to retool their image, they started championing other criminal justice reform issues, including the people who need sentencing reform on drug offenses. And so they, and as they said they would do, they created an unlikely alliance with liberals on this issue. And they joined hands with the American Civil Liberties Union and with Van Jones, who had been an activist who had been truly one of their greatest critics. And he came around to sort of holding hands with them and saying, we're all working together on this. It's been fantastic for their image. They've gotten, the Koch's general counsel, I think, has met with Valerie Jarrett on this in the Clinton, in the Obama White House four times now. And it's done a lot for them. And, you know, you have to sort of decide for yourselves, was it worth it for the what the Obama administration got out of this? I mean, the criminal justice reform package that they've been championing is falling apart now in Congress, partly because the white-collar criminal stuff that the Kochs have been pushing is so odious to the liberals that it's now everybody's choking. But it's been interesting.
Right in the middle here. Yeah, we have here.
Hi, glad to be able to talk. This is in the form of a question. It's going to sound like a statement. The two separate sets of brothers, Koch brothers, are they a conspiracy, or are they trying to inappropriately be populists? And where do you come out on either or? Are they a conspiracy, one set, or the others populists? And what is your grab on that?
Well, remember Hillary Clinton way back called the people who were against her a vast right-wing conspiracy. I think she regretted using that word. There's something about the word that seems paranoid, so I, would resist using it too, though it is funny. There's one of the characters in the book, Karl Rove, who's a big Republican operative, says, after Citizens United passes in 2010, he says, people call us the vast right-wing conspiracy, but we're really just a half-assed right-wing conspiracy. And he says, but now's the time to really get to work. And so, so they're kind of joking about it themselves. In terms of populism, I think it's hard to, I think of populism meaning it's a term that's about sort of the interests of the everyman in this country against sort of, it's usually a kind of politics that opposes big power. And so it's hard for me to define the political interests of a couple of the most powerful people in the world as populist. The Koch brothers each are worth $45 billion as of the last estimates. So $90 billion between the two of them. They're either the fourth and fifth richest people in America or the fifth and sixth, depending on which list. And their politics, I think they're true believers. I don't take that away from them. I think they believe in the power of ideas, and they've been very smart to fund a movement that pushes their ideas. But their ideas favor their financial interests always. There's almost no daylight between what's good for Koch Industries and what's good for their kind of libertarian economics. It's all about getting the government out of their way and getting fewer taxes, fewer government services, none of which they need. Privatizing, they've been opposed to Social Security, Medicaid, and Medicare since its creation. They don't need these programs, and they want to stop the kind of environmental regulations that have tripped up their company. So I don't know. I wouldn't define that as populist politics, but I think the interesting thing, and there's a chapter on the Tea Party, is how cleverly they've been able to stir ordinary people up into sort of thinking that the government is the enemy and that companies that are, the top whatever 1% that Bernie Sanders talks about is not the problem. They've been they've channeled a lot of the country's anger against the government and away from business.
Let's take somebody down front, and then we're going to go over that way. Anyone? Okay. Oh.
I was wondering about, could you wait for the microphone? Excuse me.
Okay, here's the microphone so people in the back can hear you. Go ahead, ma'am.
How are the Koch brothers involved at all with conservative churches?
Well, as libertarians, they're not religious people particularly. And so they're quite uninvolved in social issues themselves. But what they've been willing to do is form pragmatic alliances with the conservative social right. And so they've helped elect a number of extraordinarily conservative religious members of Congress, Tea Party members, even though they don't share all of their views. What you can see by what they put their money behind is what they care about. What they put their money behind are candidates and policies that will shrink the government, lower their own taxes, and get rid of regulations. And if a candidate is with them on that, they'll go along with the rest of the program if that's what it takes.
Somebody, let's see, down front in the middle here. We haven't gotten this over here.
Hi, I'm a grad student at Penn, but I'm actually from Kansas as well, where the Kochs have had a huge impact on not only state and local politics, but on our academic transparency at our universities. And so my question is, as a student, but also as consumers of information in general, how can we adequately question the information we're receiving from our professors, from the newspapers, and things like that?
Ooh. I think it's fantastic that students are trying to do this, so I applaud you too. And in Kansas, it's just become such a major issue, and in several other places around the country. As a reporter, I file lots of FOIA requests, and it sounds like hopeless, but it's really not. And I'm on the board of something called the Reporters Committee for the Freedom of the Press, which supplies legal help to anybody who is a reporter trying to file a FOIA request. So that's one thing you can do, and you actually can get answers to some extent through that. I think it's really important, though, because universities and colleges, as we all know, are often hard up for funds. And so they will take money with strings attached because they so desperately need it. And you've got some people, there's some members of the Koch organization. There's a man named Art Pope in North Carolina who's been very important. His organizations, he's kind of like a state-sized Pope figure, a Koch figure. His organization, at the same time that it militates to cut public funds for universities, he also holds out private funds so that he can influence what's being taught that way. Fund his own programs that will teach free market economics, cut programs. They recently in North Carolina cut the state funding for a center that studied poverty. So you can kind of see the ideological trend lines there. Anyway, I think it's great. I hope students are paying really close attention. Spread the word.
I just want to say for the record that I teach political journalism at Penn, and I don't take a dime from the Koch brothers. So, they don't know I exist. So, we have time for like maybe one more. So you pick whoever you.
Thank you. Without rambling a lot, I wanted to comment. It's obvious that big oil was the beneficiary of the Iraq War, as it was intended to be. It's obvious that the big banks are bigger and bigger, and competition among the banks is essentially zero. It is, I think, fairly clear that the corporations are transnational. They're not bound to any particular country, and they are governments in and of themselves. And I think the whole thing goes to make the individual feel more and more insignificant. To borrow a phrase from the 60s, enemy. People just feel alienated, so they turn around and they don't vote. And by doing that, they give the elections to people like the Koch brothers. But ultimately, the only way to get democracy back is for people to get out and vote, for people to get involved. The American people are ultimately to blame for what's going on.
Take that any direction.
Sure. I'm actually relatively optimistic despite all of this. And the part of the reason I write a book like this is because I actually believe if ordinary people read it, they'll understand it and they'll be angry and do something about it. I think that there's much more power in the electorate than there is in the Koch brothers. It just takes active participation. So I completely agree with you.
Yeah, I was just going to say, just in closing, because I'm sorry, thanks for all your questions. We're going to have to finish up. But I was just going to, I think you probably anticipated my closing question in some respects. People have been describing the book to me with two words. One is powerful, and the other one is depressing. You know, because it's like, chapter after chapter of this relentless, this. But, where does the hope lie? And is it like to sort of reframe what your answer was, like journalists write what they do in part because they think it's a way to empower readers?
Yeah, I'm sorry if it's depressing. I hoped more that it would be. I heard from the copy editors at Doubleday who were young and they were working on it, and they were saying back to my editor, nothing had ever made them madder than reading this book. And I thought, yes, it's not, I'd rather have anger than depression, because I think that motivates people. And I really, I wouldn't be a reporter if I didn't think that if you give people information, they'll act smartly on it. I really do think that. So I have a lot of hope.
An upbeat note, folks. Thank Jane for being here.